Page 9. Will be conforming. Once we figure out the earlier action. Page 10. Thanks. Moving on to the Department of Aging and State Long-Term Care Ombudsman Program. Governor had no proposal. Senate and Assembly do. Welcome.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Ginny Bello with the Analyst's Office. As your agenda indicates, both the Senate and Assembly's packages included some new funding for the State Long-Term Care Ombudsman Program. Each adopted $1.4 million from special funds to increase monitoring in the state's long-term care institutions such as skilled nursing facilities. The difference here is really that the Assembly also provided $5 million general fund for the long-term care ombudsman program. And we checked in with the department to give you a little context on sort of how that would translate. They estimate that they could hire roughly 85 new staff at the local level to provide these services. And those staff would also be able to leverage hundreds of volunteers for the long-term care ombudsman program. They'd be doing more complaint investigations, but also more upfront monitoring of the facilities. And just one other note is this would be the first general fund that this program received since it was last cut in 2007-8.
On that point, we have a history of using general funds then.
Right. Prior to 2007-8, we did use general fund. And they also received some other special funding and federal funding.
And the 1.4 million special funds that the Assembly and the Senate are both proposing come from the same fund?
They come from a state nursing home citations account, I believe.
Okay. Very good. Ms. Bosler?
Yes, so there is $8.1 million. Most of that is federal funds for the base program. We are supportive of the Senate position, but don't support the additional $5 million general fund augmentation, just given the state's fiscal health and the concerns that this would be an ongoing annual expenditure.
I could have given you a presentation. Very good. No surprises there. Any questions from the committee? We're going to leave this open as well.
Yeah, we'll hold this one open. The Assembly added the additional resources. $3 million would be spent more on unannounced monitoring visits, $1.5 million in complaint investigation, and $500,000 for volunteer recruitment and training. So we're willing to hold this open as we talk about these issues. Clearly, our skilled nursing facility and residential care facility for the elderly is becoming a major issue that we need to provide support for. And, you know, when we look at our budget, and I have to acknowledge our member from San Bernardino, when we look at our budget, it's often the one piece that seems to be lacking the most is the support we provide for our elderly. And each year, you know, we do so little in that category. I think last year we probably did maybe 500,000 or something like that, but not really very much. And so this year we made an effort to try to be a little bit more sensitive to the elderly in terms of trying to put more resources into the budget that we think would enhance their lives and enhance their security. And so that's why this, as long as, well, a few other items are in there, because that's one of the major complaints I hear when I go out and do my budget presentations, and who shows up are the elderly, the seniors who show up, and they look at it and they think we're doing great things for preschool and child care, and they just excited about it, but then they always look and say, where's the stuff from us? You know, we have needs too, and that is true. And so I'm trying to be a little bit more sensitive to those issues. So we'll hold this item open, though.
Thank you. Moving to page 11, in-home supportive services. The governor's proposal.
So we talked about this a little bit in the previous item on developmental services, but the federal government, the U.S. Department of Labor, promulgated a regulation a few years ago now that required the provision of overtime to individuals who are working in the home care industry. Last year, as part of the budget, that a new rule was implemented. And shortly before the budget was released, there was a court action back in Washington, D.C. That vacated the rule by the Department of Labor. That is currently on appeal, and we hope to have a resolution later this summer. The governor's budget, though, did assume the implementation on July 1. There is some chance that they could implement it retroactively, and we've been moving forward, making changes in the CMIP system to support the implementation when the legal issues are resolved.
I have a note here that the earliest date that a decision could be rendered would be September 1st. You have different information?
We don't have any information. That could be true. My understanding it is sometime after July 1.
So would you agree then if we don't know even by the middle of June, and I would suspect we're not, that we could score the savings for the 3 months of the year, that it would be delayed in implementation?
It is something we discussed when we were building our May revision. I think our concern is that there's some chance that they would implement it retroactively to July 1, and that's something that we wanted to be prepared for.
So that is a possibility as well?
It is a possibility.
All right.
Then we'll hold that open.
Unless you want to go with the Senate version?
No.
What, to pocket $65,000?
We could pocket 65,000
Yeah.
between the two of us?
It's rather low-hanging fruit. What is, I don't mean to
We
be
would
cavalier
also
about
be,
it.
yeah, what's that?
65 million.
What would you see, or LAO as well, as potential
Still don't have it.
downside or unintended consequences if we did score the $64.9 million, only to find out, let's say September 1st, that they're going to take a retroactive action?
So what would be the downside? I mean, I think there's a lot of implementation issues that we would have to work through because while we're working on the IT components, this is a very big effort to change the way in which we pay individuals in the system, which is a very large system, as you know. So the downside impacts is that there would be a deficiency in the program 3 months into the budget year, which would be a concern for the administration.
But we could put this into our regular reserve account, where just...
Well, that's what the Special Fund for Economic Uncertainties is there for, is absolutely to address issues when we don't get the estimate quite right, which in healthcare services and in the DDS budgets were to the tune of a couple $100 million in the current year. So that's something that, that we do routinely use, the Special Fund for Economic Uncertainties. I think with this situation, we want to use our best estimates of how much we need to support implementation in the budget year, and that's why we stuck with the July 1 implementation.
But with regard to IT, we're not going to be doing anything until we hear from the federal government anyway, right? So that's pretty much on hold and moot until we hear from them.
Well, we're still working on. There's various groundwork changes that were already in process before we heard the announcement. So some of those have been placed on hold, and some of them continue to move forward. But there will need to be additional programming after we hear definitively. I'll just also note that we're not supportive of the Assembly's action, which is to remove the barriers to implement, is how it's characterized here. But that would be to implement regardless of what happens at the federal court. Our implementation really hinged on the federal rule change. And if the federal rule is not upheld, then we would not move forward in implementation.
For further consideration, Senator Nielsen.
I just might note, I may not agree with the administration's interpretation of what the Reserve for Economic Uncertainties is. This would be a little broader extension, I think, than I envisioned in being a part of that.
That's separate. Yeah. All right. Page 12. Restoration of the 7% reduction of service hours for IHSS.
So in January, we proposed a new managed care organization tax. We currently have an MCO tax, but the federal government changed made significant changes to the rules in which that tax can be extended. And so we proposed a new tax in January. And as part of that, our proposal was to restore the 7% reduction that was negotiated during the budget reductions during the recession. So that the value is the $228 million. So our proposal is to fund it from the proceeds of the tax revenues. I believe the Senate has put forward general fund, and the Assembly has continued to rely on the MCO tax revenues, but general fund as a backstop if the MCO tax is not passed by the legislature.
So the difference between the two houses at this point is just the source of the fund. And where is the administration at this point with regard to MCO and its prospects, either, if not this year, when?
Yes, so we continue to work with all parties, the health plans, and the legislature to secure passage of the MCO tax with the budget.
And I recognize, I think we all do, that the changes in the federal law make it that much more challenging for us here under this dome. Any other questions from committee? Senator Nielsen.
Question for Nance, or well, let a journalist. Wouldn't this be a violation of a settlement agreement that was wrought, in terms of the former budget? Or maybe finance can answer that. It seems like this, it'd be a restoration and controverting a settlement agreement in a lawsuit.
The settlement agreement required that we put forward a proposal to fund the 7% restoration, which we did with the January budget.
As I read these, the recommendations, particularly the Senate and the Assembly recommendations, in many ways they're the same. Both of them saying basically fund this, period. One says if the MCO becomes available, then that's where the money comes from. I think the Senate is saying, let's fund it regardless of what happens with MCO. But the Assembly is basically saying the same thing. Let's fund this thing. And then if we get MCO, that's a great thing. We can use those resources. But if we don't get the MCO, we still should fund it. I mean, maybe it's semantics. Maybe I'm too fundamental. I don't know what the deal is. But it seems as if we're saying the same thing. Basically, let's fund this here. Let's fund this 7%. And if we get MCO, then that becomes a source of funding. But if not, it seems we're both saying we use general funds to fund the 7%. Unless there's some nuances I'm missing in this conversation, please enlighten me if I'm missing it.
No, you got it exactly.
I can talk about general fund. That's a item for discussion, but the Reserve for Economic Uncertainties is not Prop 2.
Thank you, Senator Nielsen.
Mm-hmm. So if we all, are we in agreement that this is what we're saying?
Yes, indeed.
Okay.
It's either
One's cuter language than the
MCO
other?
or general fund.
Right, but basically fund it. Our priority, of course, is MCO, but if not, general fund, right? Is that what we're saying in this language? No, it may not be what you're saying, but but this is what the two proposals say. This is, in other words, in the end, this is what it'll boil down to be what we're going to vote on, up or down with this, right?
What I'm saying, funded irrespective of the MCO tax.
Right, but I'm just saying, but if MCO comes around, use that, right?
Yes.
Is that what you're saying?
We're on the same page. We're on the same page.
Okay, everybody's wibbling wobbling like we're not on the same page, but I think we're saying the same thing.
Yeah, and I think that our proposal is to pass the managed care organization tax with the budget, and then that would fund the 7%.
Right, your proposal is completely contingent upon MCO. Right.
Yes, and so our concern with, say, the approach the Assembly took is that if the managed care tax is not passed by the time the budget takes, then they would be stuck funding that out of the reserve. And as I said earlier, there's significant uncertainty already implicit in our estimates for the Medi-Cal program, for the IHSS program, the DDS program, and so there needs to be a sufficient special fund for economic uncertainties to address that. So this would be a significant additional hit if the general fund was not built in and the MCO tax was not passed.
Right. I understand the governor's proposal is totally different, because you're strictly MCO only. And I'm generally sensing in the Democratic side is that we need to fund this. MCO would be a wonderful way to do it. But if not, if all else fails, there's something else. But I gather, based on what's the conversation, that we'll hold this item open. I just want to make sure we were clear in what we were saying as to what the two proposals, because they're very similar. It's just in the end, we end up in the same spot. Okay?
Assemblywoman Melendez.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think we're all warming up now. We've had a couple hours to kind of get into the groove. I see the writing on the wall with respect to this being funded, but if that's what's going to happen, then this probably needs to be scored properly because it's not on here right now, at least for the Assembly version. We're talking about special funds and federal funds, and it's not been scored properly if it's going to come out of the general fund. So I would just ask that if we could have a more detailed, robust conversation about that should we get to that point. I mean, I'm not necessarily in favor of it, but if we're going to do it, let's at least do it the right way. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Assemblywoman. In the Senate proposal, we did score it. We were honest about it, but we will be leaving this open today. Yeah. Page 13 is managed care hour reporting.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Jenny Bella with the Analyst's Office. What you have in front of you here is an Assembly proposal to make changes to the case management and payrolling system for the in-home supportive services program. As part of the Coordinated Care Initiative several years ago, as you're aware, the in-home supportive services program became a managed care benefit in certain counties. And the legislation that implemented the Coordinated Care Initiative allowed the managed care plans to augment in-home supportive services hours on their own dime if they decided that they wanted to provide more services for someone in their own home. The issue really here is that they have been wanting to use the CMIPS 2 system, or the payrolling and IT system for in-home supportive services, to be able to track and pay for those hours, and to also allow the recipients to use the same provider for those hours. So this change would facilitate that. It would allow the managed care plans to utilize the system for those extra hours in line with legislative intent.
Thank you, Ms. Bello. Assemblywoman Weber, you have a bill similar to this on the floor?
Fortunately, I have a bill that just got passed on the floor, AB 7097. Yes, because this is it's more like a glitch in our system than anything else in terms of our inability to pay people for the services that are there, that the managed care groups are putting forth in terms of extra services. And what is happening here is we can basically align these things with the use of one system is what is there, because they can't pay them a certain way, and so it's really a glitch. It's an administrative kind of problem that we're having in the payrolling system. This would allow those who are getting extra services, extra hours, to actually have those persons paid where they're not being able to do that now, and to keep the same individuals in terms of service, because that way you have one kind of payment system, and you actually end up they're able to maintain the same persons who are doing the service. It's really kind of strange that we would pass something and approve it and allow it to happen, and then we don't have the mechanisms to make it happen. And this is one of those small things that you do that basically upgrades our system and allows the payroll systems to basically compensate the individuals who've done the overtime work that's there, that right now they're not able to do. So that's where we are.
Congratulations on your bill.
Yes, now we have to fund it.
Ms. Bello, have you done any estimates? Is the $2 million, in your opinion, an accurate figure?
I think the administration may have an updated estimate of what they believe the actual cost is, but I think the total fund, the estimate of $7 million is reasonable. It may be an issue of the breakout between general fund and federal funds being more of a 50-50 split. but they could probably verify that. I think just one other note that I would make for just context is all of the in-home supportive services issues that you're considering today have implications for this same IT system.
That's right.
And so it may be something that as you land on these various issues, you direct the administration and let them know what your priorities are in terms of the ordering of and the sequencing of these types of events.
Thank you. Ms. Bosser, you have anything to add to that?
Just two items. One, normally on these kinds of expenditures, there is a 50-50 cost sharing. So we do think the general fund portion would be higher than the $2 million. The other thing, just following on what Ms. Bella said, is that there are a lot of change orders that are in process with the CMIP system, especially if we do end up moving forward with the Fair Labor Standards Act change. There'll be significant workload associated with standing up those changes to the system quickly. This is a big system that cuts many checks every month, and so there's a lot of work that goes into the programming on this. We do continue to work very diligently to implement the Coordinated Care Initiative. There is a lot of efforts underway at the Department of Healthcare Services to really improve the implementation and increase the participation in this program. There's been significant opt-out rates in some of the counties, Los Angeles County being one of them. And so the transition to a managed care benefit for the long-term services and supports it's a process. We've made some big changes in the last few years as we've implemented this very big and different initiative. But not all of the changes have been implemented. We understand the intent behind this. We're just not sure if this is the right time to make this change, but we do understand the spirit of it, and it's definitely in line with the CCI concept that we continue to work through.
Thank you. Yes, Senator Nelson.
Ms. Bosworth, what would be your thoughts of the extra hours, though? Would this be an obligation of the state general fund or the plan? The extra hours.
I'll have Adam Dorsey answer that.
Yes.
Adam Dorsey, Finance. So the rates that were built in to the managed care capitation rates for CCI individuals actually include an increase for these IHSS-like services. So these are actually paid for to the health plans in their capitation rate currently.
Thank you.
So we'll be keeping this open. We've just gotten word that the Assembly floor is completing its work for the day, so our Assembly colleagues have to get back to their floor to cast some votes. So we're going to recess until 3:30. Sorry for the interruption. Of our committee is returning, we can begin the presentation on it. That would be the CalWorks COLA issue.
Whoa, sorry.
Thank you.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chair and members.
Good
Ryan
afternoon.
Woolsey with the Legislative Analyst's Office. The item before you is a one-time cost of living adjustment that was provided by the Assembly to CalWorks cash grants, along with $46 million in the budget year, which reflects a half year of implementation, growing to roughly $95 million in the following year. As you can see in the table on the handout, the effect of the proposed COLA would be to increase the cash grant that a family of 3 in a high-cost county receives every month by $18 after adjusting for partially offsetting reductions in CalFresh food assistance. This comes to about a $12 a month increase in total resources for these families, assuming that they have no other income. Just to provide a little bit more context on the other side of the handout, historically, CalWORKs grants were subject to an annual cost of living adjustment that was specified in state law. These were suspended in many years for the annual budget process, but the statutory mechanism remained. As part of the 2009-10 budget, the statutory annual COLA was eliminated on an ongoing basis. CalWORKs grants currently remain below pre-recession levels when looking back to 2007-8. Since that time, CalWORKs grants have been both reduced and increased. There was a 4% grant reduction in 2009, an 8% grant reduction in 2011, followed by 2 5% grant increases in 2014, and then very recently in April 2015. That brings us to the current moment where we're slightly below where we were before the recession. Finally, I'll note that the 2013-14 budget package created a statutory mechanism that provides somewhat regular grant increases that function like a COLA, but are not based on cost of living changes. They're rather based on availability of funds in a dedicated funding account. There is not enough money in that account to provide a grant increase in the budget year, but we estimate that funds could be available as early as the following year for a minor grant increase at that time.
Thank you, Mr. Woolsey. Historically, prior to 2009, how long going back did we have a COLA for CalWORKs?
The COLA,
Since the beginning of CalWORKs?
that's my understanding.
And I would imagine those kinds of decisions were all left to the states when Congress took its actions in the 1990s, in the early 90s.
That's correct. The amount of the grant is at the state's discretion.
And do we know, again, historically, prior to the crash of 08, did most states have COLAs?
I'm not in a position to say whether most states did have a COLA, but as I mentioned, California did suspend our COLA in many years, despite its being in state law.
So prior to 09, there were suspensions?
That's correct.
Right, okay. As times were good or better or worse. And can you explain the funding mechanism for the child poverty and family support, supplemental support sub-account?
Certainly. As part of the 2013-14 budget package, the legislature made several changes to 1991 realignment that were related to the Affordable Care Act and savings related to the expansion of Medi-Cal. At the same time, certain growth funds were redirected to enter the Child Poverty and Family Supplemental Support sub-account. These amounts grow in every year that there's growth in sales tax and vehicle license fee revenues. We estimate that in general, there will be between $60 and $80 million in a given year of new revenues that come in. And state law provides that each year the Department of Finance estimate how much of a grant increase could be provided with available funds after the costs of prior increases are paid for. The 2 5% grant increases that I mentioned were funded from this sub-account, and their current costs exceed the available funds, and as a result, there will be no grant increase from the child poverty account in the budget year.
Okay. Thank you for that bit of history. Ms. Bossler.
Sure. We'll just, I would just add that there has been the 2 5% COLAs the last 2 years, and in the budget year, because the source of the funding from the child poverty sub-account is not sufficient to cover the costs of those 2 5% COLAs. There's an additional
Those
general
are actually 5%
each year,
grants.
5% increases each year.
So should we be just differentiating between grants and COLAs?
5% increase in the grants level.
Okay.
So so that the general fund is contributing around $50 million in the budget year to fully fund those commitments that were made over the last 2 years. We also have similar estimates that there will be additional monies in the child poverty sub-account in the upcoming years, with a balance being available possibly in 16-17, but most likely in 17-18 for an additional COLA. We did not have any proposal in this area Obviously, we continue to be very concerned about the ongoing balance of the state and committing additional ongoing funding such as this.
Thank you.